How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and today I'm going to be going over everything you need to know to get up to date in the current cEDH metagame. I'm going to be going over some of the most popular decks, how they look to win, some of the staples that define our decks, as well as the main archetypes as I sort of see them right now in cEDH in terms of successful decks. This isn't going to be an incredibly deep dive into every single one of these decks and going over everything about all of them. There's no way I have enough time for that. This is sort of just to give you a decent understanding of some of the main decks, main cards, get a good idea of what the cEDH metagame looks like right now. If you've played before, maybe this can help you get up to date, or this can help kind of jumpstart you into learning about the format, maybe help you pick a deck. And I've got tons of other content that you can check out that goes more in depth on specific decks, goes over tournaments, all kinds of good stuff like that. If you enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think I should talk about next. Thank you as always to my amazing patrons over on Patreon, whose support helps me make a whole bunch of videos for you guys all the time. Support on Patreon genuinely does mean a ton to me. You can get perks over there. Check that out. And I think with all that being said, we can go ahead and hop into it. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. This is one of the best ways you can support the channel. And again, it's just free stuff. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try. Now, we're going to be talking about 8 decks today, and I kind of wanted to give a little bit of context for the way that I think of decks at the moment. Historically, and even in some of my older content, you'll see archetypes described as either mid-range, stacks, or turbo. And I think 2 of those are very much real successful archetypes, but stacks has been changed and replaced, I think, into sort of a new archetype that resembles it and often uses stacks pieces, or, cards that lock out your opponent or hate bears or things that affect them and keep them off balance. But it isn't really their primary game plan. Mid-range decks are decks that usually look to win in the mid to late game. Often they can present earlier wins if they would need to or they want to, but typically they're looking to generate traditional card advantage by using draw engines or relying on card quality to grind advantage to be able to break through the sort of multiplayer interaction that you have to be able to beat in a format like this. Turbo decks look to win quicker than this. They look to get underneath those mid-range decks. They look to use rituals and fast mana and quick, powerful combos to be able to get wins before those decks and use free interaction to look to catch those mid-range decks off guard while they're developing and hope to win before those decks can take over the game. The third archetype I usually refer to as like inevitability engines, and maybe wingens is a better name for it. That's maybe a little bit cuter, but these are decks that have an engine in the command zone that when left unchecked will win the game. Decks like Sisay and Magda really highlight this at the top level, where these decks need to activate their commanders once or twice, and usually that means the game's now over. They will use their commanders and set up a win. Often at instant speed, often without having to cast spells. They're very difficult to interact with, and their inevitability makes it very hard for mid-range decks to kind of take advantage of their ability to grind card advantage. If these decks get to do their thing, they just win out from under them. Often doesn't even matter how many cards your opponents have. So you see a bit of a cycle where those decks tend to not be the most interactive. So turbo decks can kind of prey upon them in a pod, whereas the mid-range decks are very interactive, but their interaction and their choice to take the game to a longer position often leads them to potentially being preyed upon by those wingen decks, if we want to call them that. Somebody else think of a better term. I'm sure there is one. So we're going to be looking at 8 deck lists, some more than others. This one is a really great example of some of the staples of the format, so we'll probably look at it a little bit longer. And we're going to be looking at deck lists that have done very well recently. So we're taking a look at Corey's list from Cowtown Throwdown, which I think is a really good example of what a traditional Tymna Kraum deck list looks like. So Tymna and Kraum, these commanders offer 2 things really. They offer very good colors, lots of colors, very good in cEDH. You get you access to more cards due to the kind of silly commander color identity rules. They also offer you lots of card advantage in both of them. Both of these commanders draw you cards, Tymna through combat, Kraum through other players casting spells. This is one of the few decks I do have an in-depth guide to. If you're interested in that, check that out in the card above. This is a great example of a deck we can use to illustrate a lot of the staples and what cEDH looks like right now. Our commanders, very generic, draw us cards. If things aren't going well, get us back into a game. Creatures, right now, Tymna Kraums are about 13 creatures. If you played Tymna Kraum back in the day or other Tymna decks, you might have been used to seeing higher creature counts. Nowadays, they don't lean too much in the Tymna plan because creatures are very popular and powerful. it can be hard to get in with them. Tymna's a bit more of a backup. So you have creatures that generate advantage themselves, come down really cheap. Cards like Esper Sentinel. This sort of effect where you get to draw cards off of your opponent's game actions or get any sort of advantage off of them. Very, very powerful in this format. Ragavan, powerful in pretty much every format it's legal in. It gets you a whole lot, usually better in the early game, comes up in the mid to late game, can especially be good against top deck tutors, sniping them out by dashing a Ragavan in. Tymna Kraum has a couple little hate pieces as well. Drannith Magistrate is a card we're seeing less of in cEDH Tymna Kraum decks right now, but is very popular because it shuts down the ability for people to cast their commanders, as well as use graveyard-centric combos and synergies that we'll talk about. Lotho, similarly to Esper Sentinel, except for mana. Orcish Bowmasters. There's a lot of card draw in this format. Orcish Bowmasters really takes over a game really quick. In multiplayer, if you've played Commander at all, or especially cEDH, you've seen what this card can do. Another kind of hateful piece, Tymna Kraum Cinderun, is Opposition Agent, which stops opponents from being able to search. And if you are able to time it to where you get it, you hit them in response to their own tutor, you get to search as well. Really plays into the game plan that they have. One of trying to run decent creatures to work with Tymna, as well as holding up mana to interact in those mid games and stop their opponents from winning before they can. Then we got the cards that are just pretty broken in our format. Dockside Extortionist is arguably the main character of cEDH at the moment. It breaks mana production in a way no other card really does. Dockside count for 4. It's better than a Dark Ritual. The mana gets to sit around. Cards like Dockside Extortionist are the reason that you see cards here like Phantasmal Image and Phyrexian Metamorph. These are both clones that let you copy your opponent's Docksides or your own. It's not that uncommon to do something like Dockside for 5, spend 2 of the treasures, Phantasmal Image, copy the Dockside, use a bounce spell, return the Dockside, do that again, and then do something really big and powerful like one of our combos or powerful cards we'll get to like Ad Nauseam. There are entire decks built around Dockside Extortionist. We'll get to 1 or 2 of them, but even decks that aren't trying to break Dockside or combo with it still run the card because it is absurd at breaking open a game of Commander and arguably is the most bannable card in our format, depending on who you ask. Grand Abolisher and Ranger Captain of Eos. Both of these help us shut out our opponents. Grand Abolisher does it very cleanly every turn on our turn. Opponents can't cast spells, activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. And then Ranger Captain of Eos, arguably better in some regards, just because you can use it defensively. You can play it down and on an opponent's turn when they're going to combo off or do something, you know they've set something up, you can in their upkeep sacrifice Ranger Captain, make it to where they can't do anything. A lot of times people kind of want it in play because you're the table police, but then when you get to untap with it and you've drawn cards off of it, you just crack it and you get to win the game. It's very powerful and warps tables around it. Card positive. It goes and gets you your Ragavan or more often than not your Esper Sentinel. Simian Spirit Guide makes mana. We love making mana in this format. We need to turn cards into mana and mana into cards. And then last but certainly not least is Thassa's Oracle. You're probably familiar with this one. If we empty our library, we get to win the game. This is the main way that a lot of cEDH decks win, if not with its combo with Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact, which we'll cover, in combination with Underworld Breach, which is the other super busted combo that most decks are built around. Sorceries. So you're going to see a little bit of variance between these. Very often, though, you're going to see tutors, either top deck or to hand, things like your Diabolic Intent, your Demonic Tutors. Rituals, Rite of Flame often being the main one you see as a sorcery, can really help jumpstart a post Ad Nauseam. Again, we'll get to that. Wheels, this format one likes to, if you have a bunch of mana, you can have very broken starts. You want to be able to spend a whole bunch of mana, cast a wheel, reset, buy yourself back into a game. If you're in an insurmountable position where all your opponents have a million cards and you have none, resolving a Wheel of Fortune can really help you get yourself back in. And also, we use our graveyard a lot in this format, so dumping those cards can be really relevant. Toxic Deluge here is a bit of a flex slot. You tend to see mid-rangey decks opt for 1, maybe 2 board wipes just to help them deal with the decks that can grind better into the late game, or if they don't have that many creatures. Again, we're only on 13 here. There are decks that run as many as like 20 to 25. Some of those decks, Toxic Deluge or cards like Fire Covenant, can really help you get yourself back into the game. Mnemonic Betrayal lines up really well with Wheel of Fortune. Your opponents will also be filling their own graveyards, making win attempts, casting powerful spells. Mean Bet breaks multiplayer by letting us take advantage of those. And then Savine's Wreck. This is part of a combo with Intuition, where you're able to Intuition for Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and the Savine's Wreck itself. And no matter what your opponents give you, you're going to be able to assemble a win with Underworld Breach, assuming you have enough cards in your graveyard. Instance. cEDH is incredibly interactive and very powerful. We only get so much mana, so cheap or free interaction ideally is the name of the game. You have cards like Pact of Negation, 0 mana, counter a spell. Blue is a very powerful part of the format, so you tend to see cards like Pyroblast and potentially Red Elemental Blast as well to deal with that. Cheap interaction like Mental Misstep, Flusterstorm, Swan Song, Deflecting Swat, which you can use on a counter spell, make it target Deflecting Swat. So Deflecting Swat is kind of its own counter spell. Fierce Guardianship, Force of Negation, Mindbreak Trap, Force of Will. You see lots of free and cheap interaction. We got to do with all our opponents. Ideally, it lets you tap out for developing some kind of advantage engine, which is a main part of most cEDH decks, and then lets you interact and make sure you don't die while you're tapped out. Again, you're going to see lots of tutors like Enlightened Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Vampiric Tutor. Help us break the Highlander format. Rituals like Dark Ritual, adds 3 black, and Cabal Ritual. You get to add Threshold, it makes 5 black, and it's a very, very powerful card. Depending on the list, you might see more creature removal like Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile. New cards like Strict Serenade, which are coming in that lets you interact with creatures, which are becoming more and more part of our format. Those combo pieces we talked about. Demonic Consultation with Thassa's Oracle. You spend 2 blue, you spend a black. Oracle trigger on the stack. You exile your entire library. That as well as Tainted Pact, which will let us exile a whole library. A nice A plus B combo that just lets us win, get rid of our whole library. The Oracle says we win the game. Brain Freeze is going to let us combo with Underworld Breach. I promise we'll get there, but basically Breach is going to let us cast spells from our graveyard. Brain Freeze makes it very, very easy to get spells in our graveyard. Intuition, like I talked about with Savine's Wreck, we get to search our library for 3 cards. 2 of them go to the graveyard. Our opponents choose. We get to set up a package where we always get what we want. And then another one of the most defining cards of the format, which sort of ebbs and flows in terms of how much impact it has, but has always been a relevant player, is Ad Nauseam. 3 black, reveal the top card of your library, put it into your hand, lose life equal to its commemorative mana cost. Repeat this process any number of times. This basically allows us to take advantage of the fact that we have very, very low cost spells in our deck, and we get to get a whole bunch of cards all at once. It's not uncommon for somebody turn 2, turn 3, cast an Ad Nauseam. If it resolves, they spend 30 to more life, depending on how much they have. Symbol a whole bunch of mana, counter spells, rituals, and combo pieces or tutors to be able to find a win right there. Artifacts. We're gonna have lots of fast mana in this format. Chrome Mox, Jeweled Lotus. Lots of free and cheap mana. If you're used to playing Commander or Legacy or even Vintage, you might see a lot of these. Lion's Eye Diamond is another part of our combo with Underworld Breach, where with it, Breach, and Brain Freeze, we're able to mill ourselves out, get access to our whole deck, and then win with Thassa's Oracle, protected by pretty much everything we could want. You tend to see these talisman effects that can just help you develop mana. It's really important to be playing ahead of curve in the format. And then Wishclaw Talisman, which is another tutor, got some downside in multiplayer. It's kind of one of the more all-in tutors, and there's a lot of politicking around it. Enchantments. Mystic Remora draws us cards when our opponents cast non-creature spells unless they pay 4. They don't usually have that much mana lying around, so it usually just draws us cards. This is one of the more warping cards in our format. Somebody plays this on turn 1. It completely changes the context of your turn and how you want to do it. You'll often hear the phrase, don't feed the fish, which means, hey, dude, let's not give the fish player like 5 cards for 1 mana. Let's kind of, get it hungry and, not feed it and make them continue paying mana into it. Eventually, the fish will go away, assuming they don't get to develop too much mana. Heuristic Study. If you played Commander, you know this one. Kind of a similar deal, except it never goes away and the tax is a little bit less, but it hits every spell. Both of these cards, when they come down, they completely warp the game around themselves. Anything like this, including cards like Smothering Tithe that take advantage of, hey, my opponent does the thing, you better pay for that. They're very powerful. Smothering Tithe can be a great way to net a bunch of mana. Doesn't always show up in Tymna Kraum decks, but in mid-rangey decks, it's never that uncommon. Underworld Breach. This is the card we talked about. We get to use this to exile 3 cards from our graveyard to cast a spell from our graveyard. Like I mentioned with Lion's Eye Diamond and Brain Freeze, those cards let us discard our hand, make some mana with LED, escape that Brain Freeze by exiling some cards, and then because we're going to net more and more cards into our graveyard each time, we'll be able to get ahead of that escape cost and be able to mill our library out. If we need to, mill out all of our opponents, win with Thassa's Oracle, win with some of their cards, the Mnemonic Betrayal, whatever we got to do. Underworld Breach, Brain Freeze, and Lion's Eye Diamond pretty much let you do anything. Necropotence, another powerful card in other formats. Well, I guess really only Vintage and Timeless. We got 40 life. You get to pay a whole bunch of life. Use this as a draw engine, sort of. Really takes advantage of other staples in our format, like Final Fortune, which is 2 mana to take an extra turn, where you lose the game at the end of that turn, as well as Born Upon a Wind, which gives your spells flash. You Necro and you've got some mana lying around. You Necro very, very deep, like 30 life. You can hope to spike a Born Upon a Wind or Final Fortune. With Born Upon a Wind, just win in your instep right there by casting all the spells. Final Fortune, sculpting a perfect 7 and trying to win on your next turn. And then lands. Things that really stand out about cEDH mana bases are that you're going to see cards like Ancient Tomb pretty much ubiquitously. Fetches and dual lands are the name of the game. We want perfect mana, especially the higher our colors are. So you're going to see those in basically every single deck. Gemstone Caverns is also a staple because of the fact that we're not going first 75% of the time. So we're going to be able to start with a mana advantage, which is usually very big. And then channel lands. Otawara and Boseiju specifically are very, very powerful. We talked about those kind of silence effects like Grand Abolisher, Ranger Captain, and then the card Silence as well, which keeps your opponents from casting spells. Otawara, Boseiju can get around those. They're also not spells, so most interaction doesn't work on them. They are very, very powerful in our format. So really, what Tymna Kraum is a mid-rangey deck that gets to draw more cards than everybody else because of their commanders and their colors. They get access to most of the best cards in the format. They're the real good stuff pile of the format, and they tend to look to get a bunch of card advantage, and then win either with Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation or Tainted Pact behind Grand Abolisher, Ranger Captain, or the card Silence, something like that. Or look to assemble Underworld Breach with Intuition. Like I said, you can buy it back with Savine's Wreck and win with Underworld Breach, all behind either their free interaction or their silence effects or whatever, just shutting you out, having more cards than everybody else, having better cards than everybody else, and just winning the game. A lot of these cards are staples of this format, basically all of them. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in other decks and in decks that aren't featured in this video, like Tivit, for instance, is very similar to this deck, other than the fact that commander works a little differently and it doesn't have access to red. You're going to see a lot of these stapley cards in a lot of cEDH decks, especially when looking at the artifacts. These cards are very much staples of our format. Next up, we're looking at Zoro Toro's Kenrith deck. Kenrith gives us access to all 5 colors, and in some ways can be similar and has been similarly built to decks like Tymna Kraum, where they just run a lot of the best cards and staples, but especially now has sort of gotten a new identity that cares a lot more about winning with creature combos. One thing you might have noticed looking at the interaction that we have in this format with cards like Flusterstorm, Mental Misstep, Swan Song, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Negation, things like that, is that a lot of the interaction that most decks tend to run does not counter creature spells. Like none of those spells can hit Dockside Extortionist, for instance. Kenrith is one of a decent number of decks that looks to win through infinite mana and works as an infinite mana outlet. That's kind of his main purpose. If we're able to generate infinite mana with Kenrith, we're able to activate his target player draws a card ability to make all of our opponents draw their decks and lose. And we can just, if we've netted infinite mana, there's not really a way they're likely to be able to interact with us beyond a split-second spell, because we're just going to be able to keep putting those draw triggers on the stack above whatever they try to do. Some of Kenrith's abilities also help us to assemble those combos. We're taking a look at our first green deck. We have mana dorks like Birds of Paradise, Deathrite Shaman, the Hierarchs, Ignoble, and Noble, basically running the dorks that give us access to the most colors. These are great things to lead on. They are notably worse nowadays since the printing of Orcish Bowmasters, but overall it's still worth using them to be able to push our mana production, especially in a way that doesn't feed cards like Mystic Remora. You're going to notice a lot of similar cards like Esper, Ragavan, Dockside, Drannith, as well as a few standouts that are pretty different. Agatha the Vile Cauldron is sort of a staple of the new type of Kenrith decks that are looking to combo with activated abilities. She reduces the cost of yours if you make her larger, like you can with Kenrith's ability by putting +1/+1 counter on her. She can reduce the cost of our abilities even more, making it easier to do things like loop Kenrith's 5 mana ability to put a creature into play. A unique loop that Kenrith gets access to just by running cards already popular in cEDH is with Phantasmal Image and Dockside Extortionist. Because if we have a Phantasmal Image that's a copy of Dockside, we can spend 1 and a green or less if we have the cost reduced to put a counter on Phantasmal Image. It will die because it's been targeted. It has a sacrifice clause to die. Putting it in the graveyard, and then we can reanimate it with Kenrith, put it back into play. And if we have either our abilities reduced or the Dockside count high enough, we can loop this and net infinite treasures and kill our opponents with Kenrith. Other cards also enable this, like Mayhem Devil. We can also just do this with Dockside by sacking 2 treasures, pinging down our own Dockside, putting them into the graveyard, activating Kenrith. Another way we can go infinite with Dockside is with the card Emil the Blessed. You can spend 3 to flicker one of your creatures, return to the battlefield under your control. And with Dockside, we only need a Dockside count of 4 to go infinite like this. Pretty easy. And again, you can do this with just casting 2 creatures. I can cast Dockside, cast Emil, activate Emil, target Dockside. If no one has something like a Swords to Plowshares or some other removal spell, that just happens, or they happen to have like exactly Force of Will in hand. Kinnan is another mainstay of some cEDH decks in that it really can amp up your mana production. Like I said, we're running dorks, we're comboing with treasures, we run lots of mana rocks. Kinnan makes it to where when we tap one of those things, we get an extra mana out of them. Kinnan itself is a deck that we're going to be talking about, but this is a really powerful option you'll see in a lot of blue-green decks, especially if they have some kind of infinite mana outlet. It makes it a lot easier. But beyond that, you're going to see a lot of good stuff kind of cards. Cards like Archivist of Ogden, the draw cards, Bloom Tinder, which is a good dork. Evolution Witness is another card we can combo with Kenrith because it will get us back a permanent whenever we use Kenrith to put a counter on it. Anyway, it gets a counter on it, we get a permanent back. So we can go infinite with Lion's Eye Diamond in this card, as well as just buy back other permanents from our graveyard to keep casting them, which is also what 6 helps us do, although in a different kind of way. Value cards that are just good in regular Commander tend to also be pretty good in our format. They're efficient enough for what they do, like Displacer Kitten, or just broken enough like Kitten. Talion is a really popular value engine, especially in slower decks that don't mind having a 4-drop in their deck, like, for instance, a deck that doesn't run Ad Nauseam. Sorceries, you will see a few different cards in green. You see some of the ones we already saw, but Finale of Devastation is a really impactful card in our format. It basically is the same rate as Demonic Tutor, but with a little bit of mystery involved. Like if I spend Finale X equals 2, I'm spending 4 mana and I get a 2-drop and put it straight into play. That's like the same rate as if I Demonic Tutored for the Dockside. Finale just puts it straight into play. You also get a little bit of unknown, tricky stuff that can happen where people think you're getting Dockside and the count is low, but you actually put Grand Abolisher into play and they no longer can interact. Culling Ritual is another powerful commander card, takes advantage of multiplayer, can get us an insane amount of mana, completely change the dynamic of the board, and just totally tip the scale of who's winning a game. Instance, you're going to see a lot of the same cards that we saw in Tymna, though you do see a card like Worldly Tutor showing up, getting some more consistency out of our tutors. Same with Eladamri's Call, which puts a creature into our hand. Abrupt Decay, a nice removal spell that can't be countered, which is very nice when we're trying to combo through something like a Rhystic Study. Or maybe there's an opposition agent holding us back. No Ad Nauseam here. Our mana values are a little too high. Some decks will opt not to run Naz. Typically, if it's a cEDH deck, you assume it's on Naz, but they don't always have to be. Artifacts, again, very similar to what we saw in Tymna, except here we have the One Ring, which does show up in some Ad Nauseam decks, but for the most part shows up in slower decks that don't care so much about it being a 4-drop. The One Ring is not the fastest value engine in the game, but it is a very consistent one that will, if the game goes long enough like you're wanting it to in this kind of deck, absolutely outdraw most other value engines. Enchantments, very similar to Tymna, Breach, Rhystic, Mystic, Smothering Tithe, no Necropotence here. It's a little bit trickier in a 5-color deck. And then Survival of the Fittest. We are a creature and graveyard combo deck, so being able to discard a creature, combo with it, reanimate it, search up another one, go off with Dockside, whatever. Lines up really well with a lot of things we're trying to do. And then our mana base. The main difference here is we're 5 colors. There's that Besage I was talking about, one of the more powerful lands in our format. And then we run a lot of creatures, so we're okay with running cards like Gaia's Cradle to help produce more mana, and it rewards us for those dorks as well. A notable exclusion in this Kenrith build is the lack of Thassa's Oracle. Typically, you will still see that and Underworld Breach in the decks. Kenrith, because it is itself a win condition and has other things that can win the game in it, like Mayhem Devil, they can choose not to run it. Typically, you should expect that your opponents are running Thassa's Oracle unless they've given you a reason not to, or it's something similar to like the Planeswalker Sisay build, which we'll go over later. Next up, we're looking at Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. I told you we would take a look at this one. Everything that we said about Kinnan's ability to jumpstart your mana production also works when he's in the command zone, and it happens a lot more frequently. Kinnan is a deck that goes kind of back and forth in the metagame, like a lot. Currently, it's on a bit of a downtrend. Some cards like Orcish Bowmasters and just faster decks being more prevalent right now have made it struggle a bit more, but it always has a pretty ridiculous ability to generate a ton of mana, and itself having an ability to pump mana and into something is pretty nice. So like we mentioned, Kinnan makes your non-land permanents that tap for mana add 1 more, but also for 5 green blue, you can look at the top 5 cards of your library, put a non-human creature from them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Yeah, we have decent utility creatures to put into play. Sometimes we can spend 7 mana and get a dork, right? It's not that great, but one of the defining things of Kinnan is we run very large creatures to take advantage of his mana production that is already very nice, and then also his ability to flip them straight into play. I can spend 7 mana and get the 9 mana Void Winnower into play without my opponents knowing it's going to happen. That can really disrupt the flow of a game when you think you have everything under control and then suddenly you can't cast spells with even converted mana costs, or Kinnan has literally tripled its mana production with Nyx Bloom Ancient, things like that. You're going to see lots of mana dorks and lots of creatures with utility on them. So more clones like Flesh Duplicate, which works a little bit better with some of our cards we run in some decks. A lot of times the issue you might have with like Phantasmal Image is if we want to bounce it or otherwise target our own card, doesn't really work very well. But with Flesh Duplicate, we don't have to worry about that. It's more likely to get to sit around. It's not going to get one Bowmaster ping and just vanish. Cards like Gilded Drake show up in cEDH a decent amount, again, because one, they can be very disruptive, especially to very commander focused decks. Some decks even struggle to win if their commander is taken control of and they're sort of forced to find a removal spell to kill their own commander to get it back, or to copy the Gilded Drake, which happens a lot too. So it can be used to really shut somebody down or get your own advantage engine. If somebody has something like a Kraum in play, pretty good. We run a bunch of utility, especially non-humans, that are nice to flip into. Cards like Manglehorn can disrupt our opponents. Perplexing Chimera, maybe the most disruptive possible card. Completely just makes the game of Magic into a total mess, especially once you get multiples of them into play. People start cloning them. Cards like Wandering Archaic will let us take advantage of our opponent's game actions. We love to do. Same with Consecrated Sphinx. Opponent draws a card, we draw two. Pretty good deal. Seedborn Muse is one of the more powerful options we can get out because if we have the mana to activate Kinnan or just do other things, Seedborn Muse lets us do it on our opponent's turns as well. You're going to see this a lot in decks, especially that have access to a commander that can be a mana sink. Thrasios, which is also a popular commander option, is a card in here that can also take advantage of it and is also our main mana sink. So a big thing with Kinnan is that if we're able to produce infinite mana, specifically infinite blue and green mana, we're able to pump that mana into Kinnan and get all of our non-humans into play, which eventually means we're going to get Thrasios into play. Thrasios will let us pump all our mana into him and put all our lands into play and draw all the cards out of our deck. From there, we can either win with a Boss's Oracle if you're running that, which most of the list don't, or something like a very large Finale of Devastation to kill our opponents, really just beating them to death, making them unable to do anything. We can bounce all their lands with Tidespell Tyrant. We can do all kinds of things and basically just lock everybody out from playing. And ways we have to do that. One, the most common combo you see with Kinnan is with Basalt Monolith. Because Kinnan makes Basalt tap for 4, we can then untap it for 3, and then repeat that process so we can get infinite colorless mana very easily just with these two cards. And then from there, one, that's just good. Having infinite mana is good, although we need colored mana for Kinnan. So a lot of times you'll run cards like Mirage Mirror, which lets us copy a land. It has a somewhat convoluted sounding line with Basalt. But basically we alternate between Basalt and a land that taps for blue and green, and we're able to filter our mana into blue-green. You'll also potentially see some creatures that decks opt to run that lets you filter mana. And also, if you're just able to get Thrasios at any point, if you have infinite colorless mana, you get to draw your whole deck and do the whole thing. Another ways that we can go infinite is with the card Hullbreaker Horror and Tidespell Tyrant. Both of them have the ability to, when we cast a spell, return something to its owner's hand. Tidespell can hit lands, but the main thing we care about is our mana rocks. If we have a Hullbreaker Horror in play, and 2 mana rocks that are mana positive, we can alternate casting one, bouncing the other, and tapping them down in between to net infinite mana. So for instance, with Mana Crypt and Mox Amber, I can cast Mox Amber, use the Hullbreaker Horde and bounce my Mana Crypt. When Mox Amber comes into play, tap it for mana, cast Mana Crypt, return Amber, tap Mana Crypt, and go infinite from there. This works with a lot of different cards, and Kinnan makes it a little bit easier because often we can do something like go infinite with Mana Crypt, which taps for 3 with Kinnan in play, and Fellwar Stone, which taps for 2, and we only need 2 mana to do the whole thing. Sorceries, we're going to have tutors, 2 that go get creatures and 2 that get artifacts, because a lot of the ways that we win the game are with artifacts. Instance, you're going to see a lot of those similar cards. A few different options because we are 1, not a Nas deck, we can't be, and 2, we generate a little bit more mana than everyone else, and we have a little bit different of a plan than everyone else. So we get to run a few different things. Cards like Crop Rotation can help us find utility lands or powerful lands like Gaia's Cradle. Mana Drain can help us power out our bigger creatures as well as just hit any type of spell, which is nice. And then Court of Calling is an instant speed ability to put any creature into play as long as you got the mana for it. Works really well in decks that already have lots of creatures lying around. And especially if they have utility creatures to be able to search up that can really disrupt something, like being able to, in response to a Dockside Extortionist, search up a Manglehorn and make sure their treasures come into play tap. Artifacts, we're going to run lots of mana. That's what Kinnan really does. We're a big mana deck. So lots of ways to take advantage of our commander, as well as combo things like I mentioned with Basalt and Mirage Mirror and Trinisphere, which we can really take advantage of because we make more mana than everybody else. Our things cost more than everybody else. So everything for us costing 3 often isn't that big of a deal, and we'll shut down our opponents who are trying to win with their Nas decks that, all their mana rocks now cost 3. Pretty tricky for them. We also love to use the One Ring. It's very, very powerful with a card like Seaborn Muse, which we're already really big on, and it just gives us another bit of card advantage. Enchantments, Rhystic Mystic, get used to seeing those in every blue deck. Lands, slightly lower count, 26. A few utility ones we haven't seen in other decks yet. Cephalid Coliseum, one you can use to loop with Endurance as a more niche thing to win an instant speed. Not going to go through that whole loop. They're a little bit much for the purposes of this video. Emergent Zone is a very popular option in crop rotation decks because it gives you the ability to play at instant speed kind of out of nowhere, similar to Born Upon a Wind. And then Homeward Path is a card that has seen more play back when Gilded Drake was more popular and is good for that purpose. But also we're running Perplexing Chimera, so we can exchange somebody's spell for our Chimera and then tap this to get Chimera back, and they're right back in the spot that they were, except that we just got their spell for free. And then Manamo, which is a card that has started to see much more play with the printing of the One Ring. Was already pretty good with lands like Gaia's Cradle. And then Treasure Vault is a way to turn our infinite colorless mana into infinite colored mana because we'll get to make infinite treasure tokens. So it's another way we can get through our whole deck with Kinnan. And then the last of the traditional mid-range decks, I guess, that we're going to be talking about is also the newest, and that is Nadu Winged Wisdom. If you play any format of Magic, you're familiar with what Nadu does and how it works. But essentially, Nadu looks to break the free targeters that we have access to, like Shuko, Lightning Greaves, and a few creature-based ones as well, to generate a ridiculous amount of advantage to the point where it's almost not a value engine. It's more of just a ridiculous combo piece in the command zone that just throws your entire deck up into play. Being in the same colors as Kinnan, we are going to see similar cards like Tezzeret, which lets us search up an artifact. We have lots of useful ones here, and we had useful ones in Kinnan as well. You're going to see some of those tutors, sort of utility creatures, mana dorks also pop up here, as well as some more unique to Nadu options. Now, Nadu, being a much newer deck, also is still developing, so don't look at this as the definitive guide to how Nadu's looked. This is just a Nadu that has already won a tournament, so we're going to talk about this one. So we've got targeters like Sylvan Safekeeper, sack a land, target creature gets Shroud, trigger Nadu, put a land into play, or put a card into your hand. Busted cards already that we've seen like Displacer Kitten, Phyrexian Metamorph, Image, you guys know these ones, but then we have the Nadu specific cards. This deck not opting to run the Nadu untap a target creatures. There's like two mana creatures that can tap and untap a creature. Here we're running a lot of cards that help to do busted things with our ability to put lands into play. Lotus Cobra, when a land enters play, we make a mana. Nadu puts land straight into play. That works great. Springheart Nantuko, very small text. Basically, when a land enters, we make a 1/1 insect. We can also, if it's attached to something, then 1 green, make a copy of something. But often we're just making 1/1 insects whenever a land enters play, and then we have something new to target with Nadu. Scoot Swarm works very similarly, but has a much more broken ceiling where once we have 6 lands in play, Scoot Swarms create a copy of Scoot Swarms. And once that happens, like once or twice, the game is basically over because you're just exponentially increasing your creature count and you're going to be able to get through your entire deck very easily. Tireless Provisioner, when a land enters play, we get a food or a treasure token. That's kind of nice. Haven't seen that in one of these decks yet. We've got tutors like Tribute Mage and Trinket Mage. These let us search up useful artifacts like Shuko, Lightning Greaves, Spellskite to protect our creatures. Dosen is very similar to Grand Abolisher, but is more all in. This is green's best option to it. You don't want to pass with a Dosen play often. It shuts you out too, but hey, it's what we got. And then there's a package here you don't see in every Nadu deck, but it's very common green sort of combo package in low colors, and that's Quirion Ranger, which lets you return a forest to untap a creature only once each turn, and Ashaya, which makes all of your creatures forest. Any creature we have that enters play is now also a land, or any non-token creature at least. We're going to trigger our landfall abilities whenever we cast a creature spell. We also get to, because Quirion Ranger is a forest, return itself to your hand, and then when we recast it, when it enters, it's a forest. And we can do this over and over as long as we have the mana to recast Quirion Ranger, especially if we can untap like a bird or something. We can do this infinitely, get infinite landfall very easily. And then Nissa Resurgent Animus, which has a whole lot of text, but one is a Lotus Cobra effect. When a land enters, you make a mana. And then also searches for a elf or an elemental on your second landfall each turn. Most notably, this will help us find Quirion Ranger, which is an elf. You see we're not running any of the Llanowar Elves effects, things like that. And then Ashaya, which is an elemental. We're also on some other elves, but they're pretty good ones too, like Tireless Provisioner, which is also great. Endurance, I think, is maybe the worst thing we can hit, but I guess deciding that it's worth running. And then Nissa's just card advantage on top of a Lotus Cobra. It's just worth running anyways. Sorceries. Eldritch Evolution. This is a pretty popular card in green decks. 1 green, sack a creature, search your library for a creature that costs mana value X or less, which where X is 2 plus the creature's mana value. This lets us do things like sacrifice a Delighted Halfling and put a Nissa into play. These are like some of the more tricky, flexible cards that you tend to see in these green decks. Lots of utility for these kind of cards, especially on Eldritch Evolution, being able to get something that costs less as well. Using that on a 3-drop means we can get any single creature out of our deck and put it straight into play. Time Twister, another variant of Wheel of Fortune. We don't really use our graveyard, so we don't mind reshuffling it. And then Fabricate, we have lots of artifacts we want to combo with. Instance, lots of similar things. You will see some Nadus run Nadu specific instance, like Sea King's Blessing, stuff like that. Here we're just running good cards. Cards like Veil of Summer, so our spells don't get countered. Bunch of counter spells, cheap interaction. Cards like Court of Calling, cheap and free ways to interact. Mainly the name of the game. Mainly looking to play a game plan to protect our engine and our combo-y stuff once we get it set up. Artifacts, some of the fast mana. Shuko, which is the premier targeter that we have access to, lets us spend 0 to target one of our creatures, trigger Nadu. For each creature we have in play, Shuko gives us 2 Nadu triggers for free. Pretty ridiculous. Lightning Greaves does a similar thing, although we can't double equip on the same creature because it has Shroud. And then Umbral Mantle also gives us some flexibility in its untap ability potentially, but again, it's just a 3 mana version of a 0 mana. And then Conqueror's Spell does a nice little Grand Abolisher impression. Mystic Ristic, get used to seeing them. And the thing with Nadu that you'll notice is they run more lands than almost any other deck, at least currently in how they're constructed. We'll see where people land, but they're running 30 to 35. A lot of cEDH decks are closer to that 25 to 28-ish range. Lots of utility lands, ways to get our commander back, like Command Beacon if it gets overly pressured. Really just running the best lands we have access to. Cards like Shifting Woodland, which let us copy a permanent in our graveyard, which is very, very powerful. Talon Gates of Madara, a new utility land that we can use to phase out a Hate Bear or some other creature we don't want in play. Urza Saga goes and gets our Shuko, main part of the deck. You gotta love it. And then a bunch of fetch lands and other utility lands we've talked about. Field of the Dead is a land that makes creatures when you put a land into play. Works really well with Nadu. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. Leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. So that's it for our traditional mid-range decks, and some of those even skirt the lines between archetypes. I don't want this to be a prescriptive thing to tell you exactly what deck is where. You have some people who build Tymna Kraum to be much more of a turbo-leaning deck, and you have people who build Kinnan to be much more of a doesn't cast spells, inevitability engine, just activate my Kinnan each turn and not really trying to mess too much with the stack. Those macro archetypes are a spectrum really just to help you kind of identify some key characteristics of decks. But now we're going to look at turbo decks. This is the cool stuff, at least in my mind. You don't have a lot of them that are on the dominant side. Sisay, the partner pairing of Rograkh and Silas, is the main one that comes up. It's the most consistent one right now. It allows you to do some of the more powerful things that other decks don't get to do. And so it's kind of the premier turbo deck at the moment, in much the same way that Tymna Kraum is the premier mid-range deck. Now, why these commanders? That's a good question. Silas is very much just here for the colors. You will sometimes cast him as a 2/2 with Death Touch, but for the most part, he is just there to provide Rograkh with the blue-black color identity. We've gone over the fact that a lot of the most busted cards are blue, black, and red, and that is what we're taking advantage of here. And then Rograkh, what does he do? He doesn't do anything. He's a 0 mana 0/1, right? The thing about Rograkh is he is a 0 mana commander. And we've already talked about some of the commander spells, cards that take advantage of creatures being in play. So what Rograkh does is enable you to always have access to some of those best cards and have an enabler for a lot of cards that don't always work, but are so powerful many decks choose to run them. For example, Infernal Plunge. Because we have Rograkh in the zone, often this is an always online red Dark Ritual. Diabolic Intent is a second demonic tutor that many black decks run, that is because we run Rograkh basically always online. Cards like Jeska's Will, which are incredibly powerful if your commander's in play, can line up awkwardly when you have like a 3 mana commander. When your commander's 0 and you can go land, mana crypt, Jeska's Will turn 1, generating 7 red and looking at 3 cards, it's very, very powerful, especially in a deck that runs wheels and cards like Underworld Breach. Another common one is Culling the Weak, which is a better Dark Ritual when we get to use that with Rograkh, as well as the commander free spells like Deflecting Swat, Fierce Guardianship, and Deadly Rollick, which exiles target creature. Always being able to threaten Fierce Guardianship from turn 1 is very impactful. And the newest option among these cards that we've got that Rograkh enables is Flare of Duplication, which is 1 red. You can sacrifice a non-token red creature instead of paying its mana cost, which Rograkh is, and we can copy target instant or sorcery, choose new targets for the copy. We've already talked about some of the most impactful cards in this format. Cards like Tainted Pact, Demonic Tutors, and the free and cheap counter spells. Ad nauseum, it's another big one, right? Flare of Duplication means that at any point, we also are threatening, if we have a single card in our hand, to copy any of our opponent's powerful instants and sorceries, or our own. We can do things like double Tainted Pact by casting Tainted Pact, hold priority, copy it, exile our library until we find Thassa's Oracle, and then let the other Tainted Pact resolve and exile our whole library, and then cast the Thassa's Oracle. Pretty dang good. Also just works pretty well with some of our tutors like Demonic Tutor. Double Demonic Tutor, pretty good. So let's kind of go through the card types and talk about this deck. So this is really a deck that leans into trying to quickly win and just trying to get out ahead of everybody else. Because we have Rograkh always there, our deck is just inherently faster than other people's because he enables a lot of those spells that other people don't always have access to. We don't even necessarily need to draw more mana than everyone else, although we run a lot of it. We just are faster by nature of having access to spells on turn 1 every time. Because we're a very proactive, sort of stormy, dedicated ad nauseum deck, we don't run that many creatures because there aren't that many that play into that game plan. Ragavan is just pretty busted. If you get a lead on him, get you extra cards, get you extra mana. Dockside Extortionist, we talked about it. He's the main character. Orcish Bowmasters is probably the card that fits the game plan of this deck the least in terms of how it traditionally plays, but it lets us keep other people from getting developed, and it also allows us to really break some of our favorite cards that we run as already, which are the wheel effects. Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, Windfall, and sometimes Wheel of Misfortune. If you get to wheel with a Bowmaster in play, you get 21 Orcish Bowmaster triggers, you probably get to kill a player or their board, and then you're left with a 22/22 token that's only getting bigger from there. It really allows these sort of decks to have an actual win con, even when all their win cons are gone, and then also just very freely get access to more bodies. We have lots of sacrifice effects, so generating tokens is nice. And then keeping those sort of mid-rangey decks in check. Decks like Tymna Kraum, they run lots of cheap creatures, and they draw lots of cards. We can keep them off balance using a card like Bowmasters, which isn't always our game plan, but because it just lines up so well with the rest of our deck, it ends up being a very good card. Thassa's Oracle, we're trying to win fast. This is the best way to do it. Bergi, whenever you cast a spell, you add red. Creatures can boast twice. I've literally never seen that come up. So we're able to use this to generate mana as we go, especially if we're casting free spells. A lot of our spells become mana positive. And then the backside of Bergi is actually really powerful too. For 5 mana, you get an artifact that lets you discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those this turn. Again, this is really powerful with wheels. Decently common play pattern to see with Harnfell is to do something like power out Harnfell and then discard a bunch of your hand the next turn, double up on your cards, or wheel. Every time you get to wheel, you're really getting 14 cards with the exile, plus you're getting to look through the 7 and potentially use those as you want. Use top deck tutors to get extra things. It's also fueling our graveyard, and we are an Underworld Breach deck as well as a Yawgmoth's Will deck, which lets us, doing the updated text, until in a turn, play lands and cast spells from our graveyard. We love casting spells, and we get to use our graveyard better than most decks get to. So both sides of Bergi are actually very, very powerful. Sometimes you'll even make plays where you use the front side of Bergi, cast a bunch of spells, net mana, bounce it back to your hand, especially in a post-Naws. Especially with Harnfell and Naws, if you Naws get 20 cards, there's basically no way you can lose. You'll find a way to win. Sorceries, very similar to Tymna Kraum with a couple differences. We are leaning to go faster than them, and we're taking advantage of the fact that we have a cheap commander. So cards like Infernal Plunge can but don't always show up. Gitaxian Probe lets us check if the coast is clear as well as crack our top deck tutors. A unique thing about Rograkh, we talked about the card Final Fortune being a pretty popular staple in this format. There are 2 other cards at sorcery speed that you can run with Last Chance and Warrior's Oath that are the exact same text but are sorcery speed. Because we are trying to jam spam win attempts very quickly, we also run these cards to have extra time walks, as you'll hear them referred to, where we have 3 spells in our deck that are 2 mana, take an extra turn. They line up very well with cards like Ad Nauseam, cards where we have to kind of set up a win line, maybe with our top deck tutors, or with card like Necropotence, which is a powerful part of this deck and something this deck gets to do a little bit better than most decks. We're always looking for gas, so we have lots of tutors and ways to refill. I mentioned the wheel effects. We like to dump our hand and wheel, get more cards. Praetor's Grasp lets us tutor an opponent's library, which is really nice and gets around opposition agent. And then Yogg-Will, a very powerful card not many decks run. It's very good in a deck like this where we're churning through our deck a lot, we're wheeling a bunch, and a lot of times just being able to cast, rituals and tutors back from our yard is enough to get us to a win, and we don't have to win with Underworld Breach, which this card does shut off. Lots of the same stuff we've been seeing, right? Tutors and rituals and all that good stuff, but we're leaning a little bit lower to the ground, so you see cards like Daze show up in Rograkh, which is just another bit of free interaction to help us, especially in those early turns where people don't have a lot of mana lying around, push through a win. Artifacts. We run lots of artifact mana. Even though we're very low on the lands, which you'll see, we still have plenty of mana sources, and we use some that get to take advantage of our commander. Cards like Paradise Mantle, we can use to turn Rograkh into a mana dork. Mox Amber as well. In this deck, we always have a red legend that comes into play for free, so it's basically Mox Ruby in this deck list. Springleaf Drum, another way to get mana out of having a 0 mana commander. Beyond that, you also see normal rocks, card like Defense Grid, which is basically our best way to have a Grand Abolisher type effect, making our opponent's spells cost 3 more on our turn. Grinding Station, which is mainly here to combo with Underworld Breach. When you have that and a mana positive or neutral mana rock, you're able to play the Grinding Station, sacrifice the mana rock, mill 3 of your own cards, recast that rock, net mana potentially, and then it untaps your Grinding Station, so you're able to mill through your library until you find a way to win with Thassa's Oracle. And then enchantments. We already talked about Mystic Rhystic, Breach, Necropotence, which this deck uses because we're so fast leaning, able to produce so much mana, uses a bit better than other decks. And again, we run those extra turn spells, which we can use with Necropotence to get a bunch of cards, take an extra turn spell, and then sculpt a perfect hand. And then Necro Dominance, which is a bit of Necropotence at home. It's certainly worse, but because we love this effect so much and we're already so ready to break it, we're okay using a slightly worse version of one of the better cards in our deck. And then lands, you'll usually see 23 to 24, often using all the soul lands. So when I say that, I mean lands that tap for 2, like Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, which taps for 2, but when we play a land, we sacrifice it. In this deck, Phyrexian Tower, because remember, we got a 0 mana creature lying around, we can Phyrexian Tower to make 2 black mana. It's pretty nice. The best lands we can run, and then typically 1 Surveil land, which gets us lots of card selection. I know it looks weird in a turbo deck, but the ability to use my fetch land to get some card selection for the next turn is actually really, really powerful. It's something I talk up all the time. Next up, this is a deck that is pretty new and I think is a little bit less of a lock to be a top contender than some of the other decks we've talked about. But I am going to mention here because I think it is still important for you to know how it works and just sort of how to attack it. We're not going to go over every card because it runs a lot of redundant effects. We're going to talk about how this deck works and how you can kind of deal with it or see if you like it at least. Cast your second spell each turn, exile the top card of your library. You get to Impulse Draw essentially. And then it has the main effect of tap, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Activate only if you've cast 3 or more spells this turn. Mainly, Stella Lee is here to be an enabler for a lot of different infinite combos that go with it. So Stella Lee, if you get that tap clause online, you've cast 3 spells, and then you cast something like, let's say, Twisted Fealty, which has you gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, it gains haste, and create a Wicked Roll token attached to up to 1 target creature. Any of these untap effects with Stella Lee, we're going to be able to use the untap. If we've cast 3 spells per turn with it still in the stack, we can tap Stella Lee and copy the untapper, let the copy resolve, untap our Stella Lee, and do it again. The original is still in the stack, we can still do this. And then any extra effect on the untap spell, we get infinitely. For instance, Twisted Fealty creates that roll token. When it's put to the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. We put the roll token on Stella, untap her, put another one on her, so the original goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. We do this infinitely, and each of our opponents die. This is a deck that's built to in a lot of the builds that I've seen at least, kind of be like an here we go, called Is It Flash Hulk, which is an old deck that just wins with one card basically. And we're going to develop mana, look for a way to win, go infinite. We have a bunch of those, pop off with Stella Lee, just casting spells, kind of storming, refiring it when we need to, recasting Stella, and then even potentially copying really impactful cards. Like if we get to copy a Jessica's Will, pretty good. Other cards we can go infinite with. Any of these untappers that draw our entire deck. So Cerulean Wisps is a 1 mana spell that we can go infinite with. Crimson Wisp, same deal. Draw the whole deck. And then from there, we can either kill everybody with Stella, like with Twisted Fealty. Because we run the Underworld Breach combo, we can then get our whole deck, have all our counter spells up, play out a whole bunch of mana, run out a defense grid, Underworld Breach, and just mill out all of our opponents. This is sort of a commander-centric turbo list, and is it? A lot of the spells are just things that get us consistency or otherwise staple cards. The wheels, tutors, lots of the best cheap and free interaction, ways to protect our Stella Lee, also more untappers. But the sort of turbo Stella Lee builds, you have to be very cautious of dealing with Stella. Another thing with Stella's ability and how this all works, I mean, we talked about how they have these multiple overlapping spells. A lot of them are instants and are very cheap. So what can happen is on an opponent's turn, counterspell war happens. Maybe I cast the spell, cast my second spell, Stella gets me a card. And then in the middle of a counterspell war, I cast Cerulean Wisp, target Stella Lee, and threaten drawing my entire deck. And maybe if you interact with that, I have Crimson Wisp on top of that and threaten drawing my entire deck again. So it can be very tricky and can again win out of nowhere. It can just keep threatening those win attempts. The commander's very cheap. It doesn't take much to get it going. You just cast a spell or two, you're there. Where it will end up by the end of the year is hard to say, but it is definitely a deck that will continue to get upgrades like a lot of the Is It Spellslinger commanders do, and always threatens to just win out of nowhere as long as this commander is in play. There's not much else I want to talk about on Stella. Again, it's a lot of the staples you've already seen, those cards that combo with it, the sort of cantripy things just to cast multiple spells in a turn. But I wanted people to know exactly what they're up against and what to worry about. If they're sandbagging interaction, maybe sandbag yours, because you don't want them to win on top of your thing. Like if you just jam a removal spell right there and then have them just combo off on top of you. That's going to be it for our turbo decks. There are some other ones we could talk about, especially that are on the edge of that sort of top tierish status or just like contenders of being, good solid A or B tier decks. A lot of those I have talked about previously, or I might talk about in the future. So let me know if there's any of those that you're interested in hearing more about. But next up, we have those wingines, or whatever you want to call them, right? The decks that just win the game with their commander. And now I'm going to actually show you what I mean by that. First up, we have Magda, Brazen Outlaw, which is 2 mana, gives our dwarves +1 attack. Whenever a dwarf becomes tapped, we create a treasure token, and we can sacrifice 5 treasures, search our library for an artifact or dragon, put it into the battlefield, shuffle. How does Magda win us the game? You might look and see some of the worst creatures you've ever seen in your life because we run just a whole bunch of cheap dwarves to trigger Magda, which makes sense, right? We want to take advantage of that ability to generate treasures right out of the command zone. The main way that Magda is an engine to win the game is that if you have Magda in play, and then you have a dwarf that is also an artifact. So like Universal Automaton, more scarily Roaming Throne, just an artifact copy of a dwarf. And you're able to activate or somehow put Clock of Omens into play. You're able to tap the Clock of Omens and the dwarf, which creates a treasure token. And then we untap target artifact. We untap the dwarf. Might be a little hard to visualize. Clock and dwarf, that's an artifact. Tap those two, untap target the artifact dwarf. Magda, when we tap that dwarf, we make a treasure. So now we've gained 1 artifact and we have an untapped dwarf. Repeat that process. Untap the dwarf, new artifact that's untapped. We can continually do this over and over and net infinite tapped treasures. One of the key parts of Magda is that its ability to sacrifice treasures and search, they do not have to be untapped. We have 5 treasures in play, they can be tapped. Artifacts can be shut off, there can be a collector roof, whatever, doesn't matter. Sack 5 treasures, boom, put the thing into play. And from there, we can have a bunch of different options. Any number of ways to just take over a game, ping people down, net infinite mana, Realm Scorcher, Hellkite. Once we're able to loop and then get those treasures untapped or turn them into mana some other way, we're going to be able to just get everybody dead real quick. You might see some builds that opt to run dragons that like on ETB damage people. A lot of those sort of builds seem to have been sort of outclassed by just the more high card quality, more useful cards being opted for, where you see a lot less of the dragons. In this build, you do see Realm Scorcher, which has an outlet and can do some things. And so the key thing with that as well is that Magda, like I said, the first part we need is Artifact Dwarf. Magda also can search for that. So if you get 2 Magda activations, you're able to search for an Artifact Dwarf, like the Roaming Throne, put it into play, use the second activation, go get the Clock of Omens, and then Roaming Throne is even netting you an extra treasure as you go because it's doubling the Magda triggers. 2 activations, depending on the board state and things that are tapped down, blah, 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 can just straight up win you the game. The other part of the game plan, though, is that you can also, for instance, if things are going a little bit slower and you're able to, you know, maybe it's turn 2, turn 3, you're able to get 1 activation and just hold it up, you lean into Magda and the other deck we're going to be talking about, Sisay, where their ability to search for something has to be more reactive and control-y in how they choose to deploy it, where they're really rewarded by being patient and not just shooting their shot the moment they can. We take a look at our artifact package. We have cards like Vexing Bauble that shut off free spells for our opponents. Thorn of Amethyst, which makes non-creature spells cost 1 more. Sphere of Resistance makes all spells cost more. Graveyard hate pieces like Unlicensed Hearse, which also line up well with our commander. Tangle Wire to slow our opponents down. Trinisphere to really slow our opponents down. Maskwood Nexus makes all our creatures dwarves, or dragons, which is pretty nice. Also works with Magda, where we can then put any or all of our creatures into play because they'll all be dragons. And then you also have like really big hate pieces like God Pharaoh statue. Your opponent's spells cost 2 more. Uba Mask is one you don't see that often, I don't feel like. This keeps players from being able to really generate too much card advantage, because if they would draw, they exile their cards, and then those cards you can only play till end of turn, so you can really shut down draw engines. So you have this toolbox package of things to be able to search for that aren't just wins or aren't just threatening a win. They'll require you to react to the board state and find the best answer to the current problem that you're facing. So in our creatures, we have a bunch of kind of cheap, junky dwarves, some that have effects that come up. Ragavan makes us treasures. Dockside Extortionist obviously makes us treasures. If Dockside count is like 10, probably just get to win. Don't even need it to be that high. And then we're going to have artifact dwarves like Adaptive Automaton. Battered Golem, which is a cool one because if we make that a dwarf, whenever we tap it, we make a treasure. And so an artifact comes into play. So we're able to, if we're able to keep tapping it down, we're able to untap it and tap it infinitely and make treasures, which is pretty sick. Dwarven Blood Boiler is the main way to do that. Tap down the golem and get it, go infinite. Gimli gets us treasures. Plundering Barbarian destroys something or makes treasures. Facebreaker makes treasures. You can see we really like making treasures. And then I mentioned Twin Shot Sniper is an uncounterable way to deal 2 damage to a creature. Cards like Opposition Agent really mess this deck up, so you want to be able to deal with that card as many ways as possible. More stapley things like Jessica's Will. We have a cheap commander. Cheap bits of interaction. Great Train Heist is going to let us take an extra combat, which is really nice because our dwarves, a lot of times the easiest way we have to get them tapped down is just swinging at people for like 2 or 3 damage. Artifacts. We already talked a decent bit about the package. We've got other hate pieces I didn't mention, like Chalice of the Void. You will see some Magdas opt to run a lot of vehicles as ways to get value out of the dwarves and tap them down pretty easily. Vehicles, notably, you can tap down, activate their crew cost at instant speed whenever, do it on opponent's turns, whenever. Clown Car is a popular one you'll see because it's a 0 mana vehicle. Another really big one to be able to tutor for that comes up a decent amount, like the game's just getting out of control, is Portal to Phyrexia. Being able to activate Magda, put this into play. Each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures is basically just a plague wind on all of your opponents, just wipes out everything they have a lot of times. And then also generates you value. Each turn you're reanimating somebody's thing. Reanimated Grand Abolish or reanimated Dockside. Pretty hot. Blood Moon you basically will see in mono red decks. Nice way to shut people out. It can be iffy because you can still cast Dockside with a Blood Moon in play. And a lot of times the Grixis decks and the Turbo stuff don't mind the Blood Moon that much, but it can be very disruptive still. And then lands, we're going to have cool ones that only Magda really runs that let you like tap down your creatures, like Holdout Settlement, which is kind of like a soul land because of that. Inventor's Fair, which lets us tutor things up. We're one of the few decks that gets to run powerful cards like Mishra's Workshop because we run so many artifacts. Treasure Vault, we love making treasures. But yeah, Magda, one of the sort of premier decks recently of the format, really takes advantage of not having to cast spells and just operates on an axis that can be very tricky. A lot of times, if you don't know how to play against this deck, if you don't understand what it can tutor for at any given time and the way that it actually wins the game, you can play into what they're wanting you to do, where you just interact with Magda, kind of like I mentioned with Stella Lee, where you just shoot off a removal spell on Magda, and then they just combo off on top of you. It can also be really nice if you're more of the table police to understand what Magda has access to, because sometimes you can point them towards helping the table out by saying like, hey, I know you guys usually run Curse Mirror. You could actually copy this, help us deal with this, or search for the Portal to Phyrexia right now while this creature combo deck only has 3 creatures and they have their Dockside trigger on the stack. Get rid of a lot of their stuff in play. Being able to work with them is nice, but then you also need to be able to know how to work against them. All right, this took a little bit longer than I thought it would. It's a new day, and our last deck we're going to be talking about is Sisay, Weather Light Captain. So Sisay is another 5-color deck, costs 2 and a white, 2/2, and its power toughness is very relevant. Sisay Weather Light Captain gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents you control, and you can spend 1 mana of each color to search your library for a legendary permanent card with mana value less than Sisay's power, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So Sisay, just on its surface, provides an ability to have sort of a toolboxy option like Magda does to be able to search up artifacts or dragons. But here we have the ability to search up legendary permanents, of which there are a million and a million more printed every week, it feels like. So this is one of the few decks you'll see that will use planeswalkers, and we'll go over why each of these are ran, although not all of them are necessarily staples. You're also going to see legendary creatures, some we've talked about already, like Ragavan, Kinnan, Lotho, alongside some other really useful ones like Derevi, which is going to let us untap permanents, Kutzel, which works sort of like a Grand Abolisher, but on a legend, and then sort of more utility creatures or things that can really take advantage of what Sisay does. Rocco lets you have a tutor for any other creature. Solvala can help you make a lot of mana, especially if your Sisay is especially big, and we do lots of tapping, untapping stuff, so Solvala can generate a lot of mana. Emil the Blessed, we talked about in Kenrith. It can combo with Dockside and potentially with Derevi as well, with a card like Gaia's Cradle. We have a mana outlet in the command zone. We have the ability to search up legends. Emil, and then stuff like Dockside Extortionist lines up incredibly well at letting us generate infinite mana, search it up, and then put all of our legends into play. And then some other utility ones you'll see. Not every deck will run, like Urtai, which can destroy creatures or counter spells, Sakashima, which is a clone on a legend, and then Talion, which is a good value engine. What this deck is really known for is using Sisay to chain together ways to generate more mana and get more Sisay activations to work your way up to some kind of combo finish. It's very notable that Sisay starts out as a 2/2, so when you first activate it, if you have no other legends in play, it can only search up things that cost 1 or less. So your legendary lands like Gaia's Cradle you can search up for, or your legends like Ragavan. But as we get more legends in play, she becomes bigger and we get more options. Especially when you get multiple searches, you might get in a position where you do something like, you have a Sisay, let's say that's at 3 power, you search and find a Kinnan, and then are able to search again, and now Sisay has been buffed up potentially 2 more power, up to 5, and you can search for a 4-drop like Dihada, which makes treasures, which are doubled up by Kinnan. And then you can search up for something even bigger, like maybe Nicol Bolas. Now that you've got your Sisay even bigger. The sort of main planeswalkers that are mainstays for the combos that you see are Amanatu, with its main mode being -1, exile another target permanent you own, then return to the battlefield under your control. Flicker it, basically. Saheeli Rai with a -2 that creates a copy of target artifact or creature you control, and it enters with haste. Teferi, which keeps players from being able to interact, and then also can bounce either someone else's permanent or one of yours to hand. Tyvar, which has 2 incredible modes and an amazing static ability. It lets all our creatures activate their abilities as though they have haste, which is really good for our multi-mana dorks like Bloom Tinder and Fabro Elder, which can both tap for up to 5 mana. You can use the +1 to untap one of those creatures. Not crazy to imagine a board state where you Tyvar and he makes you 10 mana the turn he comes down. 2 Sisay activations worth. You can also -2, mill 3 cards, and then return a creature that costs 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you mill over or you already had in your graveyard a Bloom Tinder, Dockside, Kinnan, something like that, boom, it's into play, and it can activate its abilities as though it had haste. Tyvar is crazy. And Nicol Bolas, which is probably the wildest appearing card here, it looks very casual. The main thing Nicol Bolas is here for is the sort of big planeswalker combo we're trying to build up towards. So we already talked about Amanatu being able to flicker things, and Nicol Bolas copies the abilities of other planeswalkers. And there's one other legend that we're going to search for to be able to combo between these two to do whatever we want, and that is Oath of Teferi, which allows us to activate the loyalty abilities of planeswalkers we control twice each turn. What we can do is say we have Amanatu in play, Nicol Bolas in play, and anything we can flicker to make mana. You can -Amanatu, flicker something, -Nicol Bolas, flicker something, -Nicol Bolas again, flicker something else, -Amanatu, target Nicol Bolas, he's reset. He can now flicker Amanatu, and they can both minus and then be used to flicker each other. So you can keep flickering out permanents like Dockside Extortionist in your lands, and they can just go back and forth because the Oath of Teferi will keep them able to activate and then reset each other. So that's kind of one of the lines you'll build towards. Another thing that you can do, we're kind of known for being a big Dockside Extortionist combo deck. One thing you might be able to do is cast the Dockside or put it into play somehow. Have enough mana to activate Sisay. Activate Sisay and search up like Amanatu and get your Sisay count higher. When Amanatu enters, -1, flicker that Dockside. I have Sisay activation mana again, and my Sisay count is bigger, so search up something even bigger like the Nicole Bolas or the Oath of Teferi or whatever you might need. You can keep chaining these too, where I use Amanatu, flicker Dockside. I use Saheeli Rai, make a copy of Dockside. I use Teferi, put Dockside back in my hand, recast Dockside. Or again, like if you have Bloom Tender, I can search for Tyvar, tap down Bloom Tender, search for Amanatu, flicker Bloom Tender, make a new Bloom Tender with Saheeli. A lot of these will let you chain your way up once you have the mana to get going. And again, though, we also get to use them as a toolboxy thing like we did with Magda, where we can search up something as we need it. You can search up Oko, very well known in other formats, to turn any creature or artifact just into a 3/3 elk that has no abilities. Also potentially exchange control of somebody's permanent. Doesn't show up in every Sisay deck, but is pretty nice in those mid-rangey games. You get something that's hating you out, like Opposition Agent again, really can prey upon this deck. You won't be able to search for the Oko, but if you get him, you'll be able to turn that Opposition Agent into a 3/3 elk. And then Dahada, which is mainly here for its -3, which has us mill 4 cards. We can put any number of legends that we milled into our hand, and then for each card we left in our graveyard, we make a treasure. So we can either use it to generate value because we run lots of legends, or we can just use it to make a bunch of treasures. Again, we can flicker out Dahada with other cards. With a card like Kinnan in play, our ability to produce mana with it is shot way through the roof. Kinnan is very, very good at any of these treasure comboing decks. We already went through most of the creatures. You're going to see some similarities to Kenrith. We got some of the dorks, the generically good cards like Esper Sentinel, cards like Bloom Tender and Faber Elder. We kind of went over why they're here. They allow us to, we already care about getting lots of colors among our permanents, and these things can allow us to combo off, repeatedly tap and untap them to activate Sisay to get a winning board state. How you actually win with Sisay, well, one, if you're on it, you can Finale of Devastation with your infinite mana. You can also use Mount Doom to kill your opponents because you'll be able to generate infinite mana, put all of your legends into play, and then eventually draw your deck with like Teferi, and you kind of be able to do whatever you want. And then you can activate Mount Doom, ping all of your opponents, flicker Mount Doom, or untap it with like Derevi, whatever. Untap it, ping everybody to death with legends. This allows you to win at instant speed. For instance, if you're able to assemble at instant speed the Dockside Emil combo, you can get infinite mana, infinite treasures, and then using like Derevi and Emil, you can untap the land over and over with you have infinite mana. So you can flicker the Derevi, untap Mount Doom, ping everybody down. Opposition Agent is a card that not every Sisay runs. Opposition Agent, being a good card in a slower deck like Sisay tends to be, does have the kind of issue that you introduce an opposition agent to the board. We talked about the prevalence of clones. Not that uncommon that someone's going to copy that op agent and now your Sisay is shut off. So if you don't see op agent in some other lists, that's why you can choose to run it, especially if you play more reactively or you're not planning to just be super devoted to the Sisay game plan. Sorceries, they don't run a lot because, the big thing most of our sorceries are for are tutors. You'll see demonic tutors, Finale of Devastations, some combination of these show up along with maybe a card like Eldritch Evolution or Neoform, some other ways to get creatures into play. They can be really helpful because, like I mentioned, a lot of the cards we combo with, like Bloom Tender, Dockside Extortionist, Faber Elder, are not legends themselves, so Sisay can't search for those. Common thing you'll notice with Sisays is they tend to run a bit less of traditional interaction. Depending on the build, it might not be that noticeable, but they'll tend to run a counter spell or two, or maybe less than some other decks, while prioritizing a few different things. So like you're very commonly going to see Abrupt Decay to deal with opposition agents and other uncounterable ways to deal with that card because it shuts us down so hard. The best tutors we have access to, Worldly Tutor, Vamp Tutor, Court of Calling, those get us access to a lot of our deck for a really good rate. Court of Calling especially lines up well with our sit back and hold up Sisay mana plan. Dismember is another bit of cheap removal that can kill most things in our format. Dismember, not a card you see a ton of in our format just because it doesn't line up greatly with Ad Nauseam. Generally pretty good card if it makes any sense in your deck. Artifacts. A lot of the staples you're used to seeing so far, some of the best fast mana, the Wishclaw Talisman, 2 standouts, 1 Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which you'll also see in Kenrith decks. Lets us spend mana, Zora mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures. That is huge with Sisay. Also has the ability, creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. We don't inherently in the deck have lots of ways to generate counters like a Kenrith deck does, but we do have lots of activated abilities in our deck. and a lot of other creatures in the format like Ranger Captain of Eos that end up in graveyards do as well. And then Soul Cauldron itself lets you exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature, you put a +1/+1 counter on creature you control. We can do things like, oh no, my Bloom Tender has died, or I milled it over with the Hada. I will turn my Ragavan into a Bloom Tender. Just lines up really well with a lot of the things we're already trying to do. If you get like basically a couple Bloom Tenders in play because the end-step exile yours on your turn, do yours, that level of mana production is going to be really hard for the table to deal with. Another standout one is Relic of Legends. You don't see this in too many decks, but in decks with this many legends, it can really be great for your mana production. It lets you sort of get around Summoning Sickness because it taps down the creature, so you can play like a Ragavan, he's mana neutral. Immediately tap him down for another color. Great for our mana production, great at fixing colors. Pretty powerful mana rock in general for a 3 mana rock. Not too many of those to play in cEDH. Enchantments. So this is where you'll see a decent amount of variety across Sisay decks. Cultist of the Absolute is a very cheap, searchable way to buff your Sisay power up a lot, since it gives +3/+3, and it being a black legendary permanent often means that it's giving +4/+4 to Sisay, which is a huge buff. We kind of already talked about, we're not really that big into casting spells. You know, our way to win is by activating abilities. So Deafening Silence doesn't really hurt us that much. We're not a Nas deck. We're not trying to control the table by casting a million counter spells in a turn and hold up mana to deal with people that way. We're trying to do the Sisay thing, keep our opponents in check, keep them kind of locked down, and then win in a way that's hard for them to deal with. Mystic Ristic, you guys know the drill. Oath of Nissa also comes up as a little cantrip that can get you a land or creature planeswalker. Again, increases our Sisay count. It being a legendary permanent, it's pretty big, and it mana fixes for our planeswalkers. Blind Obedience is a card you'll see in a decent amount of dockside combo decks, as well as decks that are trying to slow players down. When you have this, keeping our opponent's mana rocks from coming into play untapped and treasures coming into play untapped, really good at slowing the table down. Also, can find in some games is that players might run their dockside out just to get the treasures to try to untap with them on the next turn. If they do that to you, they have a bunch of tap treasures they can't get rid of, and your dockside count just went through the roof, and your artifacts do not enter tapped, so you can go crazy. Touch the Spirit Realm is a okay bit of removal on its own, just casting it for 3 to exile something until it leaves. The main thing is that channel ability. 1 and a white, exile target artifact or creature, returns to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. We can use this one on like our dockside or something like that to double the dockside. We can use it to save one of our creatures. Somebody goes to kill it, and we can also use this to uncounterably remove opposition agent until end of turn. And Smothering Tithe, you know this one. It makes mana. We love mana, and we've already went over Oath of the Fairy. 29 lands. We went through some of the utility ones and the stuff that this deck uses. You're mainly going to have a kind of traditional good stuff 5-color mana base. Gaia's Cradle works great in this deck. It can combo with Derevi and Emil. It also can just make a bunch of mana. We can search it up with Sisay, and then we kind of went over Mount Doom already, and that's about it for the mana base. So yeah, Sisay is one of the best decks in the format right now. It is incredibly consistent. It is very inevitable, the wins that it presents. They will get up to that 5 mana. They will start activating Sisay, and when they do, they'll get a win or disrupt you or whatever. But at some point, if the game kind of gets locked out, decks like Sisay and Magda really can pop off and just take over the game, and it feels like nobody else can really do anything. Let me know down below if you found this video helpful. I sure hope you did. Of course, I can't go over every single deck in the format. I try to do my best just to make sure you guys understand generally what a lot of the top decks are looking to do. Hopefully this helps you understand some of the staples, things like that, and you have a better understanding of cEDH as a whole. Let me know if there's something specific you would like to see me cover, how I should go about updating these, or maybe doing some on, grouping some other less popular decks together that you will expect to see in tournaments, even though they're not necessarily the top contenders. Anything like that you want to see from me, let me know. I'm about to reach 10,000 subscribers, which means a whole lot to me, and it would mean a lot to me if you subscribed. Helps the channel out a ton. I love getting to make these videos for you guys. Any support that I get from you really helps me do that and make them more regularly, and hopefully make better and better stuff for you as this channel continues to grow. With all that being said though, thank you so much for watching, and as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.